Hello, Internet. My name is Bret, and this is my show. If this is your first time, I am here talking about containers and DevOps every Thursday. And let me turn on the little URLs. So, if you haven't seen my stuff before, I make courses, I do videos, podcasts, YouTubes, all the things about really just container DevOps. There is a lot of stuff you can talk about in DevOps and system administration and code deployments and all that. But I tend to focus on containers. So that's why we're here. And this week, I'm excited to talk about Docker's new Edge release feature that they announced at DockerCon, or around DockerCon at least, about using the Snyk image scanning system as part of the Docker command line. So we're going to run through that. I'm going to show that off, talk about alternatives, what image scanning is, what it isn't, what it does and what it doesn't do. And yeah, we're going to get into some demos. And I'm going to take your questions. So ask your questions in chat. They can be about really anything in container DevOps. And I'll get to them at some point throughout the hour. All right. So if you've been here before, you know the drill. Like and subscribe, all that stuff. And if you have not seen my Patreon, this is now how you can support this show, including my podcast that comes out of it, which I need to get another release out. I haven't had a podcast in a couple of weeks. And all the open source work I do, I just had another demo tool a couple weeks ago rather, that is almost finished. It needs some more documentation, but a tool for local development through TLS proxies and local testing through local TLS. That's a interesting thing that I made with Docker Compose and Traffic, a proxy tool. So that's all over on my GitHubs, and you can find all those links below. Everything else, if you can't find it, is always at my website, bretfisher.com. That'll link you to all the things that I do. All right. So thanks again for showing up and asking questions and being a part of this conversation. And let's get into it. Let's talk about it. Okay, so Docker has Docker Desktop. And Docker Desktop is more than just Docker command line and Docker engine. It adds a lot of functionality. It auto-updates a bunch of different tools on your machine as it keeps updating its version. And one of its main jobs in Windows and Mac is to create that Linux VM and manage that little tiny Linux VM that runs your Linux containers. And then, of course, if you're on Windows, you can switch to WSL2 support, which is using the Windows subsystem for Linux. And it can even switch to Windows container support, where it uses Windows binaries inside a container, or and it allows you to do that in process isolation or in Hyper-V isolation. So if you are on Windows and you haven't been around this show for the last 6 months, go check out the new Windows WSL2 support if you have the latest patch release of Windows 10. And if you don't have that, there's a way to force that to download. If you just search Windows 2004, Windows 2004 force update, I think if you just Google that, you'll find a way to tell your Windows Update client to get the latest new major release of Windows 10. And then once you do that, Windows Desktop, or Docker Desktop rather, will allow you to use something called WSL2, and it's faster, it's leaner, and it has some cool new features. All right. Now, on Docker Desktop, there are two types of releases. There is the stable release, which most of us are probably on. That's the stable stuff that you get after months and months of testing in the Edge release. Edge is kind of like beta, but to me, I run Edge, mostly because that's my job, right? My job is to tell you all the new things that are coming. I'm also a part of an internal group that Docker invites sort of power users of Docker Desktop, called the Docker Desktop Dev Preview team. So we get to play around with new things and see if we can break them. And one of those things is in the Edge release, although I do find it quite stable to just run Edge, but obviously if you're in a company using Docker, you may not be allowed to run the Edge release. But if you were to happen to be on Edge, you may have noticed very recently, possibly in the last week, that there is now a new Edge version that has a new feature in it called Docker Scan. And Docker hinted us at this during DockerCon and earlier this year, where they said that they were partnering with Snyk, or Snyk, however you want to say it. They're partnering with that company, and that company is a software security company, and one of their things is they have a software scanner for vulnerabilities. And they do not just across container images, they also do it across GitHub and Git repos and many other ways to scan for vulnerabilities. But of course, here on this show, we're most interested in container images. So if you're on the Edge release, you get this feature out of the box. Now, you don't need Docker Desktop to do this. You could just go to Snyk or Aqua or many of the other security scanning companies, Claire, or open scanning projects. They don't even have to be really companies. But you could use one of those all day long without this feature. What Docker Desktop now gives you is it's built in. They keep the scanner up to date. And out of the box, you can scan things without needing to go sign up for an account. So Snyk will give you a certain amount for free every month so that you can scan things. Because typically these scanners, they're either open source and you can just use them as much as you want, or they're maybe like quasi open source. Maybe they're a part of a company and they use a company scanning engine in the background, and they might be limited on the number of scans you can get for free. Or you might only be able to scan open source software or something like that. It just kind of depends on the scanner. So in this case, it's easier to get started out of the box with scanning. And that's really what Docker's bringing to the table with this partnership. Let's go to chat. I want to see if there's any questions real quick. We can get out of the way before I get into any demos or talking further about this. Paul asked, any thoughts on Portainer Ce 2.0? So I have not used it. I don't know anything about it. I know Portainer is the #1 way to manage your swarm if you're a Docker Swarm user. It's been the preferred tool for quite some time. I don't know anything about the 2.0 release, so I'm sorry, I'm not going to have any any thoughts on that. I have not used it yet, so in that newer version. But sure, if you have thoughts, if you've tried it and you have opinions or thoughts, like put them in chat. Let everybody know what you think. In Kubernetes, how many sidecar containers can we attach in a pod? Sidecar containers like service mesh, monitoring service mesh. As far as I know, you can have as many containers in a pod as your resources will support. So a pod has to run on one server, and so if you were just running one pod on that server and you had 20 side containers and you used up all the memory and CPU resources of that server, then that's how many you can have. I do not believe that there is a hard limit. Hello, Carlos. Hello, Eric. Hello, Placid87. Paul, yeah, they added K8s and Portainer too. I heard that they were doing that. So good on them. Cool. I will definitely have to check it out. But that's an interesting thing. So it sounds like it would be good in a place where you're definitely using Docker and you're using Kubernetes and maybe Swarm, but you're not looking. I would, of course, compare it to the Kubernetes dashboard and other dashboard offerings out there. There's a number of them now. So there are some shops I do know that have both Swarm and K8s. So maybe you consolidate your dashboards. That's pretty cool. You don't need Windows version 2004 anymore. They've announced a release for 1903 and 1909. So DDev, what is the announcement you're referring to? That there's WSL2 support, or because as far as I know, with Docker Desktop needs 2004. But if you could put more information in chat, I will certainly check that out. How to create a user, let's say MySQL in MySQL Docker container and Docker Compose without using Dockerfile. How to create a user. So I'm assuming you're referring to Linux users. And if you're asking about creating a Linux user in a container and you don't want to use a Docker file, then the only other alternatives are changing the entry point script on startup. Right, so like in a MySQL container, if you go look at Docker Hub, it will explain to you on the MySQL page. It'll tell you that if you add scripts, shell scripts, MySQL scripts, if you add those to a certain directory, but just by bind mounting them in, you don't even have to add them to a Docker file. You can just bind mount on startup. If you bind mount those in, then it will auto execute those. Now, some of those things may not be running as root, so you have to check whether the entry point script runs as root or runs as the MySQL user, because obviously if you're creating a Linux user, you're going to have special permissions. You're going to have be root, essentially. And so the way that I always see people creating users is in Docker files, but if you don't want to do that, then the next big thing I would do is look at either changing the entry point scripts or looking at things like where MySQL specifically has support for adding in scripts that auto run on startup. That's technically what's happening is the entry point script that they provide will go look at places that they've set up as a standard for any files that you want to be run. And that includes shell scripts, MySQL, dumps, essentially. That's that kind of stuff. So that's what I would look at. Portainer Ce is a web management interface for Docker and Swarm, and now it sounds like Kubernetes in version 2. And it's been around for years, but it got its start supporting Docker engine and Swarm. And you can put agents on each node, so it can have a full management, full management access to those nodes, whether or not they're in a Swarm orchestrating cluster. And I know that they were working on Kubernetes support, so now that if they're talking to the Kubernetes API, then in theory it doesn't really matter what you're doing in it, and Portainer can be that web interface for management for everything. Hello, Gino. Thanks for bringing Elton to the show last week. I'm learning a lot from his book and YouTube show. Great. Yeah, he's still going live. And in case you're wondering if you weren't here last week, Elton Stoneman was on the show, and he's another Docker captain, and he's doing Docker in a month of lunches, live streaming every day on YouTube. I'm not sure if it's every day, but go check out last week's show, and then just look up Elton Stoneman, and you can find his Docker in a month of lunches series. Oh, and Charlie's speculating that it's probably hacks. Hacks. So, well, that makes sense. But yeah, I have not heard any news from the Docker Captain's channel around older releases being able to support it, which is unfortunate because there are some enterprise people that just don't get 2004 yet, and they have to relay it on their business computers to get updated, and that's going to be a while, which means they can't take advantage of WSL2. And that's unfortunate. I'm new to K8s. Is there any way where we can develop the application in such a way that whenever I edit some part of my code and it should hot reload the application? Okay, so Ashay, I'm going to say, sorry if I mispronounced that. Don't think of it as hot reload. That is in container world, we think of that as an anti-pattern, because what should be happening, and there is an equivalent way to do what you're asking. What you're really saying is, when I do a git commit, can my production servers, I think that's what you're talking about, it's servers, right? So not local development, but on servers, if I commit some code, how does it get to my server automatically? And absolutely, yes, you would create a pipeline that would create a new image, and then that image would then be updated inside of your cluster. And there's multiple ways to do that. One way is known as GitOps, GitOps, which uses a Git repository with all of the YAML that describes your application in a Kubernetes way. And you can actually have those tools. One's called Flux CD, and there's another one called Argo. And those tools can easily watch for either new image versions in Docker Hub, or they can watch for new updates to your Git repo, not of your code, but of your manifest, which is how you describe your application in Kubernetes. And then they can auto-update those containers. When you think of hot reloading, that's normally reserved for local development. And if that's what you're talking about, then I would say you probably should not need to develop in Kubernetes. Ideally, you're using something like Docker Compose for development, which is much easier to manage hot reloading, in my mind. And you don't need the overhead, that's going to heat your CPUs up with Kubernetes. Because running Kubernetes locally, is typically CPU intensive, not really great on a battery life or a laptop. I have a brand new MacBook, and if I have Kubernetes running, it causes, without any applications running in Kubernetes, and it still causes my fans to turn on. So most of us in the cloud native space are not, at least all the people that I talk to and everyone I work with, we are not fans of using Kubernetes in development. Doesn't mean you can't, or it doesn't mean that no one should. It just means that ideally you don't have to, and you can leave that server orchestration tool for production servers, or just servers that are running in the cloud. That's where the orchestrator is meant to run. It's not designed to be a development tool, right? Even though there are plenty of projects and people that are trying to make it that, a lot of us are not sure that that's necessary in most cases. So hope that answers your question. If not, please continue to ask more. How are images updated when using Swarm? How can I ensure that when I do an update, like a new Docker Stack deploy or service update image, I get the latest version of an image tag? So I just talked about, there's multiple ways to do it, and you're essentially going to be building whatever your CI or CD tools are. You're going to be building a pipeline that allows you to go see the new updates in that pipeline. So for example, if you're using Jenkins or Circle CI or GitHub Actions, typically a part of that pipeline is to build your applications in an image, then test that image, right? You're going to be testing the code in that image, maybe testing some function testing, and maybe you're going to be doing unit testing, and you're going to be doing cross container testing. Essentially, maybe you're going to be testing with some databases, maybe you're not. But all that level of testing is all done in your CI, and it's after you've built the image and you're testing the image itself, right? You're testing what you put in the image, because that's what's going to be running on your servers when you go to production. And once all those tests, whatever level of testing you do, once that passes, all those completely pass, and maybe you do some things like security scanning, which we'll talk about in a little bit, or image scanning. Once you do all that, or maybe you're going to do some auditing, or you're just going to audit your code or something. Maybe you're going to minify, do a bunch of other things. Once you've done all that, then you're going to push your image to a container registry. Maybe that's Docker Hub, maybe that's something else. And then that's where you move into the CD part, the continuous deployment part. And that's going to be something where your application, your CI tool or your CD tool, maybe you have the same thing that does both, maybe you have separate tools for that, but they're going to know what you just shipped, right? That's the image you just pushed. And so you're going to have that as ideally, something like a Git SHA hash that's never recreated, it's always unique, or maybe it's a time date stamp. Those are going to be the tags you use in those images so that they're guaranteed unique for each one you push. You're not going to be wanting to use the latest tag, or reusing a tag in production, because then there's really no way to tell. It's harder to tell what you're running if you're always pushing the same image. So you're recreating these, and that application probably has an environment variable set for whatever you decide to tag as that image. And it's going to then use that for updating your servers. Now, how you do that is based on your tooling. Are you using Terraform? Are you using CloudFormation? Are you using GitOps with something like Flux CD or the other one that I just mentioned a while ago? And there's now a consortium of sorts. There's a consortium, however you want to say that. Argo is the other one I was thinking of. Argo CD. And so you would use a tool like this, Argo or Flux. And these are relatively new. These are new ideas. And the idea here is, instead of building a CI pipeline where you're manually typing in, having it do a bunch of commands that you're building on your own, like kube control apply and Docker push and all these different things, then you maybe can have some other tools that are doing that for you, that are a little more standardized. And ideally, at the end of the day, what you're trying to go for is, if your code is in Git, then you should ideally have your infrastructure in Git. And there's something we call infrastructure as code. And so ideally, you're able to look at a Git repo, and it shows you all the changes that happened in your infrastructure. And that's where GitOps comes in. So that's becoming more and more popular to do it that way. But you don't have to. It's just a question of your tooling and all the different things you have and how you can fit them all together to automatically update your apps. Now, if you happen to use Portainer, and I don't know anything about Portainer with Kubernetes yet, but Portainer with Swarm, you can have it give you a webhook that you can then tie into something like Docker Hub, and Portainer will then auto-update your service when it sees something new in, say, Docker Hub, right? You can also do that. It doesn't do it with stack deploys because there's no API for stack deploys in Docker yet, so that's a limitation. But if you do service updates, you can do all of that without any additional third-party tooling. Like, let's say you don't have CI and CD tools yet. If you want Portainer to do that for you, just look into Portainer webhooks, and if you just Google around for Swarm Portainer webhook service update, you'll probably find a bunch of tutorials on people doing that. So again, there's so many ways to do CI and automated deployment. There is no one way. I don't even teach one way because every team I work with has a different set of tools, and they're using a different CI tool. You know, maybe they're using Ansible for deployments. Maybe they're using Terraform. Maybe they're using, custom Python or shell scripts. You just never know. Every team has their own preference, so it's hard to standardize. But that's what I think the GitOps world is trying to do, like the standardizing the tools there. That's what we're trying to get to, so that we can all at least agree on something, which is use Git as the single source of truth for how your servers get updated. Next question. Has container-specific RAM memory support improved, or is host memory still reported? Brandon, I'm not sure specifically on what you're asking. You're not mentioning any tools there. Has container-specific RAM memory support improved, or is host memory still reported? So, all right. So I'm going to speculate in case you can, if you can give me a better description of your question, that would help. But I'm guessing maybe what you're talking about is Linux C group limitations. So normally, if you run an application in a container, it has access to all RAM, just like any regular app does, right? Because a container is nothing more than a regular app running in Linux that has limitations set around it. And by default, there is no limits on CPU, disk space, memory usage, network usage, and you would have to set those manually. And the way you set those and the way they work are different in Docker, Swarm, and Kubernetes. So it kind of depends on the tool you're using. But those are all using the C groups, not even a container-specific thing. It's using the C group functionality of the Linux kernel. And so if maybe what you're talking about is different applications look at what their memory limits are. For example, Java, until recently, would completely ignore C group limitations, and it would just only look at the total amount of system RAM. So recently, in the last year or so, Java, the latest releases, Java has been updated to now respect and pay attention to the Linux C group memory settings, which have existed for a lot longer than containers have. And other programming languages have their own various levels of support for C group memory settings. So maybe that's what you're talking about. If not, put them in the chat, and I'll see if I can't give you a better answer. All right, so we've got lots of great other questions. I'm going to pause on those for a minute, and we're going to get into some security scanning stuff. So back to the topic at hand. All right, over here, I've got, make it a little bigger. All right, if I make it bigger, there we go. So there is a page on Docker Docs now. I'm putting that in chat. So there's now a page that talks about the scan command. And this requires right now for you to have Docker Desktop, the Edge release. But if I'm in Docker Desktop, and I type Docker scan, you will notice I have new options. And so this is a brand new Docker command, and it's using the plugin model. So if you didn't know, Docker Desktop has a client plugin model, and you can even see what plugins you already have, I think with Docker info, I think it might show you plugins. Let me scroll up and see. Yeah. At the very top of my Docker info command, I can see all the plugins I have. And I've added some of my own. This is one that I added myself that I made called Backup, which I talked about in a previous show here on the channel. By the way, when I talk about previous episodes, you can always just go up to Bret.live. That takes you to the YouTube channel, and then you can search through the old videos there for any of this stuff. Dive is a separate tool that allows you to look inside images. It's not an image scanner. It's more like an image investigator, and allows you to dig into the different layers and look at all the different files. But that's a tool you can use normally from the command line, but I have it plugged into my Docker command line. Just makes it a little easier to run. Clip is a plugin manager made from another Docker captain, one of the Docker community leaders. And then, yeah, so I have one called App, which Docker adds in. We have BuildX, which is the new builder for making new Docker images in a new builder way. That's better than the old builder. And now I have Scan. And this is the one that we care about today. So that gives me a new Docker command. Like I just showed you, Docker Scan. And in the background, what this is doing is this is pulling down the from the company Snyk. This is pulling down their tool and using it. I'm going to put this in chat as well. Snyk. So they're a software security company, and they have this is me logged in to their dashboard. Now, with the Docker desktop thing, you don't have to have a Snyk account. That's actually one of the nice things that Docker and Snyk are doing for you here, is that when I'm in the tool, I don't necessarily have to log in with a Snyk account. You can get a free account, especially if you're using a lot of open source and making open source. They give a lot away for free, so you can get a lot more from Snyk if you create an account there. I have an account where it's just using my GitHub credentials, and it sees all of my GitHub repos and all the security updates. So I have told it to scan my GitHub, and it's got a lot of stuff there. And you can see that I have 697 high severity across all my open source, all the open source repos that I have in GitHub. And it might even be doing a few free closed source repos. I'm not even sure. If you're curious, there's a pricing page over on Snyk, and they have they tell you that you can do unlimited tests on open source projects. You can do 200 tests for open source vulnerabilities on private projects. So there is some of that there. Fixes for open source vulnerabilities, cloud source code integration with GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, Azure, CI/CD pipeline integration, priority scoring, and then you can start paying for it. I think it starts at 10 developers, so it doesn't look like there is an individual plan, but I am not an expert on their pricing, so don't take it from me. It looks like they have some container stuff, open source stuff. I'm not sure the difference, why they have these different things, but if you're doing container stuff, you probably are more interested in container images like we're talking about today. So this is not so much about their product and all that necessarily. This is more about Docker's integration. So the nice thing here is I can simply, instead of having to go sign up for Snyk, download their tool onto my machine, and then learn how to run it, I can just do Docker scan. And the first time you run it, it will ask you, hey, accept a license from Snyk. Is it okay to run a third-party tool? And I've already done that. So I have a tool called Stress. All right, so Bret Fisher, this is just a repo of mine, Bret Fisher /stress. Let's just go check that out real quick so we know what we're scanning. So Stress is a Linux tool, or just an open source tool. They probably have more than just Linux versions of it, but it allows you to stress a system. So you can say, I want to use all of 3 CPUs, and I want to use 512 mega RAM, and I just want to beat the crap out of it. And you can run that tool, and it'll just go, and it'll just heat up your system, make it a toaster. And I created an easier way to run it especially when you're trying to do it in orchestration. And so I have a this thing here that I've had a couple years, and it's actually pretty old. I don't think I've done an update since 2018, right? So it is in need of a refresh, especially when it comes to auto updating the image with the latest security vulnerabilities and patches. So it's definitely going to have some vulnerabilities in it. So really all I did was create a very simple Docker file that adds basically one extra little utility to a Debian-based image. All right, so I'm froming the Debian latest, and then I'm adding stress to it, and then I'm changing the default command to run a very specific stress command. And I'm saying I want it to use one CPU and basically beat up one CPU and then use 256 mega RAM. And then what I do is I have a bunch of other Docker files that are just like that one, but they change the default command so that you have a lot more options here where you can say, instead, I want to use I want to eat up 2 CPUs and I want to take up 1 gig of memory. So the reason I started to use this tool was I found years ago that on certain releases of Linux, I think at the time it was Debian, the C group implementation where it limited memory inside of an application and then would cause an out of memory error, which is what you want to happen if it tries to use too much memory. It didn't work. It acted like it worked, but when you would use more memory, it would not give an out of memory error, and that was a problem. So I needed a utility to test my OS install when I was running containers to make sure that the limits that I set would work. And so I just decided to create this little utility. So I have a couple of examples there on how to use it. Anyway, we're going to scan that. And when I do, it's going to give me a ton of stuff. Because for one, I've got it's old image. It's a couple years old, I think. I can actually go just to be sure. I can go over to Docker Hub. I don't think I have a link to Docker Hub there. But if I go to Docker Hub and I go look for that. Oh, now it says updated a month ago. So maybe I did do a refresh on them, but I just didn't change the repository. So if I go look at my tags, zoom in a little bit. So yeah, latest was done a month ago. So hopefully that's why I'm saying only 118 issues. Now, what does that really mean? So down here at the bottom is the summary. Tested 83 dependencies for known issues, found 118 issues. Well, an image scanner or just a vulnerability scanner scans lots of things. And so it's not as simple as simply scanning every file in the image. That's not what these are doing. That's a rather brute force method, and there's not a lot of intelligence in that, right? So in other words, it's scanning a binary, but it doesn't know what that binary is, so it doesn't know how to go check for what their vulnerabilities are. It's not literally scanning every, pre-built binary and somehow figuring that out. What it has to do is it has to use a database. There's a security database out there for common vulnerabilities, all right? And this is known as the CVE database. You can just search CVE database on Google and find multiple websites that all document these things. So these are well-known public discovered vulnerabilities, and so they're much more popular in open source, although they're not exclusive to open source. And you have to think about what thing you're scanning. So there's different sets of results. One of those may be for the apt repository type system, like apt-get, right? So that would be the Debian system. So you see here, package manager deb. So that's what this is talking about, is it's looking at that package manager. There are all kinds of other package managers. There is Yum as a package manager. There is NPM as a package manager. Alpine has its own package manager called APK. There are yet more. Python has pip, and so on and so forth. There's all these different types of package managers. So when you start looking at scanning tools, you have to care about, what do I care about scanning, and does this scanning tool support scanning those things, because not every scanning tool is created equal. Not every one of them supports every possible configuration. So a good example is, for years now, we have had spotty scanning support for Alpine-based images. And that's simply due to the Alpine Linux distribution being younger than Ubuntu or Debian or Red Hat or CentOS, and it didn't have full support for this magic database that needs to say, hey, this binary is the curl binary, so you need to go look up the CVEs for curl at this location. This is where you need to go find the version of curl that's installed, and this will tell you how to find it, and then you need to go look for those vulnerabilities for that particular version and whether or not they're fixed, right? So that database has to happen for each type of package manager. And so historically, we're getting better. Every year, Alpine has better support in the tooling. But if you'd have just looked 2 years ago, you would have likely found that whatever scanning tool you were using didn't actually know how to scan for APK binaries that are installed on your Alpine images. And that's a problem, because what would end up happening is the scanner would come back and say, oh, there's no vulnerabilities, when in fact there might be. It just didn't know how to find them. So you have to learn your tool and then learn what you need to scan. Are you an Alpine shop, a Debian shop, an Ubuntu shop? Are you a Node shop? Do you use Python? Do you use .NET Core? Like, you have to know all these things and then go look at the scanning tool to see if it supports them. All right, that's the long answer to that. So if you scroll back in this very, very long list, you will see things like there's a high security vulnerability in Perl, in the Perl base, and it's fixed in this particular version. And you can even click on the links to take you. Well, let me bring up my other browser. So each one of these has their own vulnerability page, and Snyk also keeps these on their site, as well as you can go and look at the official, the links and resources where they are on all the other places. And you can read about this here. You can, so in other words, Snyk has their own information. You might prefer the official CVE, or you might prefer some other location. Like this is probably, this is taking me to the official database, and I can see all the information about that. So here's the thing, is that it's never easy. Once you start getting into scanning, you have to decide, do we care about highs and mediums and not lows? Do we care, do we take highs and then basically this one we know about? Do we only care about ones that are high and that they have been fixed? Because some of these things are like, if there's no fix for it, you don't have a choice. You have to deploy your application, and if there's no fix, there's no way for you to update. So you have to decide what's your mitigation strategy. Do you just run it in production and be okay with that? And that's the job of a lot of times of the security team, to help you, guide you through that. But if you don't have a team to do that for you, this becomes a lot of work. So when I keep scrolling up, though, what you'll find is that all this stuff is about the APK packages. I'm sorry, the Debian packages. And if I keep scrolling, eventually, what we'll see here is, actually, we're going to do a different one, because that's a very simple one that doesn't have another programming language in it. So that's why I'm not seeing what I'm looking for. But if I scan a different one, so let's say I'm going to scan something called brown coat. And I'm just going to say latest. Brown coat is another utility I have. Let's pull that up. So this is a Node.js repository, and Snyk, like many others, understands NPM package managers. So it will look into the package.json file at all the things that I've installed and go look for the latest versions. Are there security vulnerabilities in those versions? And that's how it's going to work there. Is it's going to depend on my package.json file, which is the way that NPM and Node installs all the dependencies. And so it would go look in this file. And brown coat, by the way, in case you're not familiar with this tool, is a tool I created that is designed to fail. So what you do is you run it inside of something like Docker or Swarm or Kubernetes, and then based on different versions of the image tags, different tags, or on different things, you can actually hit curl URLs, and it will do various things. It'll crash, it'll give 503 errors or something like that. So you can check it out. Basically, it's a way to test failures. So in case you're curious about how Kubernetes handles failures, or if you want to see how Swarm handles a rollback in case your rolling update fails because of bad code, you can use this tool to make it easier to test all that. All right. So, like a good example here is I can actually force it to be slow startup to see how that orchestrator might respond to a slow starting container. Or I can force it to fail on startup and see how the orchestrator will respond to that. And ideally, it's a teaching tool to not only just for how does Kubernetes or Swarm work, but also how does my deployment and my application configuration, with all the same settings, how does it going to handle this kind of scenario, right? Anyway, I had a lot of fun with that one. So it's running npm, and npm typically, if you're building an app in Node, you're gonna have tons of dependencies, and those dependencies are gonna have their dependencies, and you're gonna end up with a bunch of security vulnerabilities. So in this case, I'm gonna do less. I'm gonna do a less on here, so that we can watch these results in real time, because it's gonna dump out a lot of stuff. All right. Now in the background, it's going to scan the from image that I'm coming from. So in this case, let's go look at the Docker file. It's scanning the node Alpine image. So in this case, we're not using the Debian package manager. We're using the Alpine package manager, APK. And it's then going to scan the npm package stuff. So notice it's saying here that it's using the APK package manager. So it found that it's in an Alpine image. And since I actually just built these, I think yesterday or the day before, they're relatively new. And it found 20 dependencies inside of Alpine, not in Node, but in Alpine, and found one issue there with the standard C++ library. Looks like the GCC compiler. So, and it says it's fixed. There is a fix out there. So then now my job is I have to go research, is there a newer update of my from image? Do I have to go back to Node? Do I need, ideally, if I'm going to do this in production, I would do the exact version here. I would always pin the exact version. So I know exactly Node 12 dot something dot something. If I went to hub and then I went down to Node, the Node image, right? I always want to pin as detailed as possible for my production stuff. So if I'm on the 12 branch, it looks like the most current one here is 12.18.3. And so I would then only be setting my Docker files to 12.18.3. And that way I know, because right now, like this image might be based on when it was built, it might be on, 12 dot something, 12.18.2, right? It might be, and I don't really know because we're doing latest. And again, latest is a crapshoot. You're not really going to know. I would have to do further investigation by doing something like a Docker history on Bret Fisher, brown coat latest. And I can maybe tell that, oh, look, there's the node version. So 12.18.3. So nice. That at least tells me, but that was 5 weeks ago. So you see this layer in my image wasn't. So the problem is that there hasn't been an update in that 5 weeks. So any patches, any vulnerabilities that came out in that 5 weeks, my image is still going to be vulnerable to that. And then that requires us to do things like go to the node. So we're using the Alpine, right? Node 12 Alpine. So let's go to I'm just going to search Alpine latest. Actually, 12 Alpine. Oops, 12 Alpine. So what I'm looking for is the one that's literally called just 12 Alpine. Because that's what we're using, right? Yeah. So, oh, there we go. So this line right here, see how I highlight the 12 Alpine? So I know that this is the Docker file that it's basing on, and it looks like it was built yesterday. So I would look at this file. It hasn't been updated since July 23rd. So this is very likely the from image that I'm looking at, and it's using Alpine 3.11. So then I have to go and go to Docker Hub and go to Alpine and look up 3.11. Is 3.11 the most current? I don't know. Oh, nope, there's a 3.12 out, and there's a 3.11.6 out. And so this is the problem, right? This is the challenge of understanding where your dependencies lie, where you're coming from. Is there even an option? At this point, because I'm on the latest node version, if I was trying to fix that thing, I'd probably have to build my own custom image from the latest Alpine and then manually install Node on top of it, because for some reason the Node image hasn't been updated, right? So this is how complicated this stuff can get pretty quick. But if we go back over to the scanning, you'll see that it's not done. It also scans my npm, and it says, I have now found that you have a package manager npm, and it's at this location. Also, you'll notice that it found a different one, and that's just because in my particular way of doing this application, I happened to copy the package JSON file in twice, but it's the same identical package file, so it's going to show the same exact results. And it says, tested 100 dependencies, known issues, no vulnerabilities found. So that's actually really good. And the reason that it's no vulnerabilities found is because I just did that yesterday. I spent hours yesterday updating my package JSON to all the latest npm updates, including all security updates and all dependencies, including the command npm audit that would then help me figure out which updates I need to do to basically make it secure again. So yeah, I did all that work. And for Node, that's a different process than it would be for Python or whatever other package manager you're using. So that's the end of that result. So it didn't, the things that it gave were just this one. It only gave me this one vulnerability. So it's a much smaller set. But if your image is a month old, you probably got dozens of vulnerabilities in there. And if you're not using a Slim or a Alpine release, if you're just using the defaults, then there's tons, more binaries in your image, and you're probably going to have a lot of vulnerabilities. For example, if we just did a Docker scan MySQL, let's do that. I'm going to give that a minute. It's got to download the image in the background as well. And then if I go to Hub, we're going to look at Hub MySQL real quick. Right. So you'll notice with MySQL that they don't really give you any options. There is no Alpine option. There is no Slim option. There is just MySQL versions. And that's really all you get. If we were to go over to something else, let's look at Postgres. Right. And they have a Debian based, which is the default, like all the official images default to Debian. And then they have an Alpine image. So let's go look at that and see the difference. So on the latest version of MySQL, there are 128 dependencies and there are 79 issues. And it's not breaking them down into high, medium, or low. But we could scan through the list, manually and look at all that. If I did this with Postgres, let's just look at Postgres real quick. All right, let's see if I got any questions real quick, because I'm sure I've seen a lot of stuff in chat. For those that aren't asking questions about scanning, I'll come back to your questions after we're done with the scanning demo. Is Splunk a good tool to use for Docker containers from the security aspect? To me, Splunk is a logging tool, so I don't see how it directly relates to security. Maybe they have some security features I'm not aware of. I haven't used Splunk in years, but to me, it's a logging tool. So to me, it's unless they've got an additional product that's for security, I don't see how it's related to security. Um, let's see. Security scanning requires Docker health checks in the image. I do not believe that's true. Security scanning doesn't relate to health checks. Health checks are about health, and security scans are about security. So when we talk about image security scanning, we're not talking about an application endpoint and testing the application. We're talking about scanning the binaries, the executables, and the libraries inside of your image tarball, right? The actual files themselves, and basically all the dependencies of your application. I see the question about K8 secrets. We'll come back to that because that's not related to scanning. Can scanning, Anton, can scanning be more verbose on vulnerabilities? For example, show exact CVE number and CVSS 3.x severity level. I don't know if that's the CVE number. The question actually is I don't know. And this tool's only days old inside of Docker Desktop. But if you look at by the way, we just finished the Postgres scan, and it has 90 issues. It was similar to the MySQL. But if we do a Postgres Alpine, for example, it's probably going to have a lot less vulnerabilities, just due to the nature of the minimal Alpine images that these things are based on. No vulnerabilities. So it's using the APK package manager. Now, I don't know about Snyk, but for example, I think it was a year or so ago, I tested Snyk, and they weren't correctly scanning Alpine at all, a container image. So I'm assuming they've fixed that since then. But a year ago, the only scanner that I knew that even worked on Alpine images reliably was, let's see where to go, was Aqua Security's Trivy, which is this is the tool that I have used for years, and a lot of the Docker captains have used, Trivy. So this is not the one built into the Docker command line. This is a separate one. So for example, often what I will do is I will use multiple scanners, especially when I'm using a new scanner. I'm not really sure about its results because I will often see different results. So if I did Trivy, Postgres, Alpine, let's see what it shows. Okay, so it shows detecting Alpine vulnerabilities 0000. Yeah, and it's on Alpine 3.12, which we know is the newest. So the fact that I get two tools that give me the same results makes me feel better about those results. In fact, if you go and you look at the Trivy repo, they do have a comparison. And I don't know. And Trivy is not, or Snyk's not in there because I think Snyk is not considered open source. These are probably all open source engines. I'm not actually sure that's true, but I'm guessing that's the reason it's not in there. But basically, Trivy is claiming that they support more languages like NPM, Python, and I don't know what the other ones are. And then the ease of use, accuracy, and suitable for CI, like they're claiming they got all the stars across the board, and that other ones are deficient in certain ways. I have certainly found that to be true of the OS packages versus application dependencies. That's like APK versus NPM, or apt-get, apt versus Python pip. Like I've definitely found trivia to be really good. So you might find that you prefer one tool over another. The nice thing about I do like a little bit of the trivia format. So if I did just Postgres without Alpine, there's going to be a lot of them, and then trivia is going to give me this is for better or for worse. It's going to give me sort of this grid view, which only works if you zoom out. So then if you zoom out, it does give you an interesting format, and I kind of like that, right? But to be fair, if you go to the dashboard, so if you're pointing Snyk at your containers and your repos, you can just use their dashboard, assuming you want to log in with a free Snyk account, and you might enjoy that view better than just the command line view. I find that the command line, I prefer to use the command line as a one-off, just to test a thing real quick, not on a daily basis, or it goes into your CI solution, right? So these tools are designed to either error out based on what you're doing, or to pass based on your requirements. So what you would want to do is look into the Snyk tool. You're going to need to get a Snyk token, and then you would run not Docker Desktop, but you would run the Snyk command line in your CI solution as an automated way every time you do an update. And so maybe you have a setting in there that says, if there are any high vulnerabilities, to fail the build by running that tool. And you would run that tool after you've built your image, but before you've pushed it up into your image repository, you'd run that tool. And maybe at first you're running the tool in CI, but you have it do a soft fail where it reports, but it doesn't literally exit one. It doesn't give you an exit error, so that you don't fail your builds. You're really just monitoring it. That's what with most teams that we implement this type of security. First, we get them comfortable with it locally. Then we implement it in CI, but we do it in with soft fail only mode, where it will report and log it, but it's not going to prevent you from moving forward. Because quite often with most teams, there are tons of vulnerabilities in their workflow, and they have to recreate their workflows. They have to change their habits in order to get these images to be secure. Well, to be more secure. They're never really fully secure. It's always something. So once you've got that, and then once your security team's comfortable, and you've got a process for handling when new vulnerabilities show up, because this is going to, if you turn this thing on full-fledged, it's going to interrupt your workflows. It's going to be a problem. You're going to have to constantly deal with these things, and it's going to take time. So hopefully that helps with your question, Anton. Sorry, I don't actually know the answer to that specifically for Snyk. And the Snyk tool itself, which it looks like I no longer have on my computer. Maybe it's Snyk CLI. Yeah, so for some reason I don't have the Snyk tool on my machine. I used to. But if you look at the Docker one, we zoom in and we just look at Docker scan. This is meant to be an ease of use tool, not all the features. So a couple of things you can do there is add the dependency tree, so you can see the dependencies that it sees in your package managers. That might be helpful for your logging. If you prefer JSON instead of the standard output, you can then use something like JQ to actually filter it down. JQ is a JSON filtering tool. And if you want to use, if you're maybe paying for Snyk, or you want higher limits than what maybe Docker Desktop does, I don't actually know the difference between the limits, but I do know that Docker Desktop with Snyk gives you some sort of free number per month. I don't know what that number is yet, but if you created a Snyk account, you saw those limits on the front page there. So you might log in with your Snyk token, and then maybe you could use your official Snyk account to do this. And so, but there's not a whole lot of other options there, right? If you use the standard Snyk tool, you're probably going to see a lot more options. There's, for example, test, wizard, protect, monitor, policy, ignore. Like there's all, config. There's a Snyk config. So that's going to give you a lot more tooling, and that's probably more appropriate for CI. Because again, this is really just about local developer, what we call shift left security, which is to get more security tools in the hands of developers so they can do more security stuff from their desktop. And this is meant to be an ease of use tool. right? All right, let's go back to chat. By the way, I think I put this in chat, but if you want to go read all of the information about this scan tool, I will again put this back into chat. Another question on there is, hey, is the scanner tool Claire responsible for scanning only or scanning and patching in order to fix the founded vulnerabilities? Um, I I'm not an expert in Claire, but most of these tools, in my experience, do not patch. That is usually a paid tool. Like, in other words, the free open source stuff tends to be really just a read-only scan. So now there are multiple ways with paid tools to patch known fixes. And I know that like there's companies that do this. Snyk does this. I don't know if Claire does it. Uh, you know, I think Aqua does it. GitHub does it as well. If you actually went into the Dependabot is what I believe it's called on there. So if I went to my okay, so this tool, that's a bad example, but here we go. This is my brown coat tool, and if you look back in my pull request, you'll see these are all Dependabot that is finding vulnerabilities in my Node.js, my npm dependencies, and then auto PRing my code in GitHub. Now that's just a feature in GitHub. I didn't have to use any third-party tools, and so if I go under the security tab, they now have, I've got the Dependabot alert set up. There's code scanning for a deeper inspection, which I have not signed up for the beta on this particular repo. So you can see that there's lots of stuff out there to scan in lots of ways. So you want to think of your tooling in a more comprehensive way. No one tool is going to solve all of your security problems. And so now what we're looking at is there's code scanning tools, and you should probably have those in addition to image scanning tools. And that's what I was focusing on today with the Docker Desktop scan feature, right? That's an image scanning tool. Another level of scanning that probably should be in your toolkit is looking at what you're running on servers in production and comparing what that is to what the known vulnerabilities are. Because as you run an application in production, if you're not updating that production container, then that is getting worse over time, right? So just because you have a new image in built doesn't mean it's actually running on all your servers yet. And so there are security teams and tools. I mean, you could use these tools and automate them on servers. There are products out there from these security companies that will put an agent on each of your servers and constantly scan those images that are running in production and look at over time how those are getting more and more insecure because they're getting more vulnerabilities. And they might even suggest to you some of these tools that if you simply updated the from image to a new version and then redeployed, that it would fix these different vulnerabilities. There's been all sorts of stuff out there. I'm not really the expert on all of them. So, let me know. Let me know in chat or in the comments what you found out there that is useful for you, or if you're using any of those tools and what you're using them for. I think that's really important. Is there any way to extend scanning process with custom tools? For example, we have our own security analyzer software. Is it possible to integrate it inside the scan pipeline? Of course it is. I mean, if that tool is able to be run from the command line and you can put it on your CI servers, then yes. The questions are, do you want to have that scanned during the image build? Because some tools are designed to do that. Some are not image aware. So you need to scan them during your build of the image so they would be running in your Docker file versus running on an image from outside the Docker file or from outside the Docker image, right? So another tool from Aqua, this is the Aqua, man, it's a big readme. This is the Aqua Trivi tool, but they have another tool that Trivi kind of replaced it, but it runs a little bit different. It's called Microscanner. And Microscanner, before Trivi was around, Microscanner was my favorite tool. And it it is meant to run from, well, it can run from inside the image. So you would basically have a run line in your Docker file that would pull down the microscanner, add in your scanning token because it needs their token to use their engine, and then it would run during the build. And if it failed, your Docker build would fail, right? So you can do things that way. You can do them as a separate step in your workflow. So inside of your CI pipeline, you would maybe build the image and then scan it after that with Trivy or with Snyk or whatever. Or you can have an image registry, right? So Docker Hub doesn't yet offer image scanning, although I think that is in their roadmap to offer image scanning again on Docker Hub. But you might have something like Quay or Docker Enterprise or one of these other registries on your own that will do image scanning. And that's going to be looking at the registry itself, right? Where you've got all of your images stored, and it will be scanning those constantly. So yeah, there's lots of ways you can do that. And really, it's up to you. It's up to you and your security team how you want to do this. I've seen it done every way imaginable. But yeah, you could always add more tools. How do you add a scan plugin to Docker? How do you add third-party plugins to Docker? So just look up Docker Client Plugin. If you want to look up the Docker Clip, I think that's what it's called. This is an unofficial third-party tool that allows you to add plugins into Docker. So I will throw that in chat for you. And you can use that to add various, and he has a set of examples here on different things that you can do. And so you can look at that. Now there's some information I think that's linked to on this page. There's some information on the official documentation on how to add a plugin. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question. All right, I'm going to back up a bit to the chat. And for those of you that were patient earlier and I did not get to your non-scanning questions, you're still welcome to talk about scanning. I'm just going to scan the chat here real quick. What is the best way to manage SSL certs for web server containers? So I don't tend to put them in the container image. We don't normally want to do that because you want to keep them secure, and normally your images are everywhere. They're all over the place, and you don't want that certificate key getting out. So you can do something. There's lots of ways to do it. So for certificates, you can use something like Traffic, which is a web proxy, and Traffic can go get those certificates for you from Let's Encrypt automatically. Traffic or other proxies can also store those certificates in Kubernetes config maps or in Swarm configs and secrets. You probably should use secrets for those, for the keys. And so Kubernetes secrets, Swarm secrets, both support that. And you can store those and then mount them on startup of your container or into the proxy on startup. If you want to like buy certificates. If you're in Kubernetes, there's something called Certificates Manager that you might look at, which is another option for how to obtain certificates and store them securely. You can also just completely outsource that and just use the load balancers of your cloud. So if you're in something like AWS or DigitalOcean or Azure, they all have solutions for getting certificates for you and storing them not in your app or not even in your container or even in your cluster. They're just storing them on the external load balancers that are set up by the cloud. So you can do that as well. If we are using Kubernetes for container orchestration, what will be use case for having Docker health checks in Docker image file? Well, one, it's documentation. So for people running, if they want to ever run that container outside of Kubernetes, then having it in the Docker file means that Docker, Docker Compose, Docker Swarm, they will all support it. So I will typically take the liveness probe, whatever that liveness probe is doing, and I will put that in the Docker file So one, I have documentation of what the health check is, and two, if I'm using anything outside of Kubernetes, it will hopefully support that automatically, right? That's the reasons. Obviously, there's only one type of health check in Docker and Docker Swarm, and there's now, let's see, 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 types of health checks in Kubernetes. There's now startup probes in Kubernetes, so there's a lot more options in Kubernetes. But they're only documented in the manifest file, so they're not going to be something that a lot of people may see. Like your developers may have nothing to do with your Kubernetes manifest file, so they wouldn't know what the health check is even supposed to be or how to test it. A great example for me is I have on this repo, the repo for Browncoat, the health checks on it broke because I'm using Alpine. And I'll be honest, it's one of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of Alpine in containers is because they break something in my containers about once every quarter or once every 6 months. And so this year, something broke in the Alpine releases where and you're using the node, if you're using the node Alpine image and you you simply do an APK add curl doesn't work. I'm sorry, if you're using -- virtual, which is a feature in the Alpine package manager. And so for some reason that -- virtual broke. And so all of my images in my courses that were using Alpine and using the virtual option for installing curl was no longer usable in the image as of a certain version of Alpine. So I don't know what the fix to that is. I just know that if I take that out now of the command line, suddenly the curl commands now work and the packages install correctly. And I didn't go looking to like report it as a bug in Alpine because reasons. Because I have a beef with Alpine because it keeps breaking random things. Earlier this year, it broke NS lookup, and NS lookup was partially broken and still partially is in Alpine. 8 months later, in the past, it's been broken with Node when it comes to file I/O. I've had things just break over time constantly. It seems like I don't have a lot of luck with Alpine, so I don't tend to recommend it to production teams that are really doing a lot of stuff. I recommend Slims like Debian Slim or Ubuntu Slims, which get you really close to being as small as Alpine, but don't break all the time for me. And they're also much more. I think they're much more highly tested, and there's a much higher utilization rate of. So bugs tend to be found faster and fixed faster in those releases than Alpine. But if you're just doing personal projects, or if you are very secure, you have a lot of high security needs and you're willing to do more testing and more validation to make sure that it doesn't break, then you probably could use Alpine. Yeah. All right. Moving on. Challenge of creating a user runtime. All right. So test a challenge with creating. A challenge with creating user at runtime is files in the image are already owned by as another user. So as an entry point, you would likely have to shown a lot of those. Yeah. So it depends. You're right, Eric. That's what I was worried about. Is it's going to be challenging at runtime to create users. Now, how you can do it if you're talking about local development is that you can do a Docker Compose command with -- user. So I don't know if you've realized this, but because I'm a big fan of Compose, I can always run something with like, let's say, sorry, let me go into my Compose sample 1. Let me see if this works. Let me just do 2. I'm not sure what's in here. So if I do a Docker Compose up in here, so this is going to spin up a container, right? Now that container is probably running, it may or may not be running as root. I don't actually know. But what you can always do is if you need to get in that container as root, even though, because right now what would happen is if I do an exec, it's going to run another process in that container, but it is going to default to running it as the last user, which may be something that is not root. So I can force that with Docker Compose exec user root, and then the name of it. This is, I'm gonna just assume Nginx, and then bash. Does that work? No. All right. Docker compose PS. All right. So I have proxy and web. So let me do web. Okay. So now see how I'm in there as root? And if you can see that on the bottom of the screen there, but it's showing the YouTube player might be messing that up. Maybe I can do that. Yeah. And so I'm in there as root. Now let's see if I take out the user root. Okay, so it's still bad example. It's still running as root. But if I were to do just a PS here, and the PS command's probably not in there, but Docker, this top of thing. Yeah, so you can see that there's worker processes that are not running as root, but the Nginx root main process is running as a root user. So that's why this example doesn't work. But just try that -- user. As long as the user exists in the container, it will work in the container, and it'll let you run whatever you want for local dev. So maybe I'm not sure if you knew that, but that's a pro tip. All right, looking through the chat. All right. There was a question on secrets. What is the secure way to create K8 secrets? Because with the built-in secret creation, we can encode the secret value to base 64 later that can be decoded as well, which is similar to plain text. Okay, so the way that secrets work, whether you're using Swarm or Kubernetes, is that they're stored in memory and they're unencrypted in memory. So base 64 isn't meant to be the encryption. The encryption of the secrets is encrypted at rest on disk. And that's done in Kubernetes by the etcd database. So when you have a properly set up Kubernetes server, whenever that key is stored in the database, it's always encrypted by etcd encryption. And then when it's brought out into the container for runtime, it's kept in memory only, never written to disk. And it uses, I believe, a tempfs in memory to add that into the container. And so that keeps it as secure as we're able to keep it. There is no way to necessarily keep it encrypted at runtime because your application needs to read the password. So you could come up with a way where your application has the decryption code and then you encrypt it, but that would be very specific to your application. And I would argue that if someone can already read memory, you're in trouble. If someone can already get into memory and read these things, if they already have root access in your container, they're going to be able to read anything that container, that application in your container is doing. They'll be able to get into memory if they want to. They'll probably be able to figure out a way to download a binary and run it so they can look at memory pages. So what we're really worried about most of the time is making sure that the database at rest doesn't have your encryption, your secrets unencrypted on disk, and also when it's running, that only the containers that are authorized to see that secret can see it, right? So that's what the K8 secrets and Swarm secrets are doing for you. Is they're making sure that only the things that are supposed to have access, and that it's never written to disk unencrypted. So the other thing that you want to concern yourself with, if you even want to go to the next level, is that you maybe would use something external, but this is way more complicated. And you might use something like one-time passwords with something like Vault. But again, that's very specific. That requires a whole bunch of extra tooling and software, and you're going to have to go through a whole lot of extra work in order to get what I would argue is sometimes a perceived increase in security. When I find that honestly, teams, when it comes to security, there is usually one of 10 major security basics that they're not doing that would be much more valuable to do than going and architecting a whole new way to store secrets that is beyond what their infrastructure currently supports. And if you're already running Kubernetes, like the step one is use the secrets out of the box, making sure that your Kubernetes is installed correctly so that etcd is encrypted. And then make sure that all of your stuff is stored in secrets. Like that's step one. And most companies that I work with have not even done that, right? So if you want to go through my list, I actually have a list, Bret.show/security first, which this is my list of all the security steps I think you should be taking, and they're ordered by difficulty. And so what I tend to find is teams go way out of the way on really hard projects with security when they're not even doing things like establishing a process for making sure that they're updating their vulnerabilities, right? Like we just talked about. So if you're already going after some custom vault solution to do one-time passwords, but you're not actually getting rid of the vulnerabilities that are existing with CVEs in your images, then you're doing things kind of in the wrong order. That's a more important thing. You can also, having the automated security scanning of images on an ongoing basis on your servers so that you're aware of what's in production. Looking into enabling SecComp and App Armor and these kinds of things are also very valuable. Looking into user namespaces so that none of your containers are running as root. That's also extremely valuable and much, once you start doing a lot of these things, it's much harder for people to even get into your containers to get those secrets. So I always look at my list of security steps in terms of how easy is it and what do I get? Do I get a big bang for my buck? Because the things at the bottom of my list that I'm going to wait and push off for long term are the things that are really complicated to implement, hard to maintain, and have a limited benefit over the easier method, right? For example, implementing your own custom SecComp profile is a lot of work and has a arguably limited set of benefits over the default SecComp profile. But most people aren't doing the default even. So just enabling that is way better than nothing, a huge step. So go check out that list in the chat. And if you're interested, we can have more security shows. I could talk about security forever. Anyway, that's a great question. Thank you so much for asking that. Another question here, how to configure 2 or more Kubernetes masternodes with HA. If one master went down, the other should be taken care of. That's going to completely depend on your deployment tool. Are you using kubadmin? Are you using Rancher? Are you using EKS? And all of those will configure your cluster completely different. So I always recommend you use a deployment tool. I highly recommend you use a distribution, and whether it's a cloud distribution like EKS or AKS, or if you are using your own, I highly recommend you use something like Rancher or VMware's solution, or one of the other tools that are supported by a paid vendor. You don't necessarily have to pay for support, but if you do, those tools will give you those kind of options. I do not recommend you use vanilla upstream and make your own custom HA because one, you're going to be the only one that knows how to support it, and that can be a problem. And two, it's really hard to get right. That's why there's all these automated tools to help you do it. So yeah, it totally depends. Obviously, to have full HA, you have to have etcd replicated. You have to have multiple pods of each layer in your control plane, and those all have to be set up correctly with the proper certificates so that if any one goes down, then all of the stuff works correctly from the other nodes. And it can be hard to get right. So I would, if it was me and you made me do it today and I couldn't use a cloud vendor, I'd probably just default to Rancher and use their tooling. Set it up. In an enterprise production environment on premise, can we build a K8s infrastructure with kubadmin? Oh, is this related to that question? Or is there any other enterprise that's going to build K8s infra? Again, if you're in an enterprise production, I don't see those teams using kubadmin. Not unless they have a lot of people to run Kubernetes. So first off, step one, if you're in any sort of business environment where you're going to be building your own Kubernetes distributions, like you're going to be building out stuff in your data center, I recommend, other consultants recommend 3 full-time Kubernetes admins. So you need to have 3 people that are have a majority of their time set aside to manage the Kubernetes platform and know Kubernetes well. That's step one. Step 2 is pick your distribution. So VMware makes a distribution. NetApp makes a distribution. Red Hat makes OpenShift distribution, right? There's all these other distributions that you can find in the landscape, right? So we go to landscape, kubernetes.cncf.io, and you can go get a list of Kubernetes vendor distributions there. And then I recommend picking one that aligns with your goals. Do you already have existing partner relationships so that you can take advantage of those? If you're running VMware, I would seriously consider the VMware tooling, because they're building their container solutions into all their existing tooling so that you can manage your VMs and your containers with one architecture. They're slowly adding those tools together over time. If you have other companies that you already have vendor relationships with, like if you're using a Linux distribution like Red Hat, or Rancher is being acquired by, I've already forgotten. Who's acquiring them? My brain is going blank. Probably on their front page. Yeah, SUSE. So if SUSE is your vendor of choice, they have their own Kubernetes enterprise distribution that you can use, and you can optionally get paid support from them. So thanks, Peter. Good catch. So yeah, so that's what I look at with enterprise teams. Unless you're a team that needs to build your own custom Kubernetes, which quite often you don't need to do, and you have at least 3 full-time kube admins, I would definitely do something like Rancher, Red Hat, OpenShift, something like that. And then you're going to just pick their tooling, right? You're going to do the deployments their way. And that's going to keep you on the rails of a reliable, most importantly, upgradable, because upgrades are not that intuitive if you're doing it on your own. It can be quite tricky. And it can be quite tricky with a vendor solution as well. But upgrades are a big deal, especially because Kubernetes, until just this week or last week, Kubernetes, you in order to be under the supported maintenance, you had to update multiple times a year. Now, at least, you can go a full year. The patches will be supported for a full year, but still, most people are not in the habit of upgrading all their infrastructure every year. And you have to start doing that. And so you need reliable upgrade tooling. And that's what these distributions will do for you. Docker container exec, user MySQL, or node, a built-in user in those images. Yeah, thanks, Test. I don't know if you were answering that question. We are developing our custom CPU architecture based on some VLIW with Linux. These CPUs are heavily used in Russia. Is there any way to contribute to Docker for adding our architecture support? Well, sure. Docker is an open source tool. So what I recommend you do is you just go to the Moby repo, all right, github.com. And in order to, this is the whole PR approach. So you can make an issue and then refer to it in the PR and start a PR. And what you want to do is you want to learn the players. You want to learn who the maintainers of the Moby project are. And you want to get in the Docker community Slack. So if you just look up Docker community Slack, you might find, docker.com/Docker community. You're going to want to go there and get into the Slack, and you'll find that a lot of the maintainers are in that Slack community. So, open source is all about humans and relationships. So yes, at the end of the day, we're all making code and putting code in other people's repos. But if you're just showing up out of the blue with a huge PR that, it's probably not going to get accepted. So you need to start from the beginning, start from the approach, asking those kind of questions and issues, maybe going through some of the other issues and finding who is commenting on architecture type stuff, who's, going and looking at the source code of Docker and seeing what was the last architecture that was added. Maybe it was a mainframe architecture, and going and seeing who was working on that project, and then maybe pinging them in a new issue and saying, hey, what would you think? What would the steps be? That's how I would do it, right? There are contribution guidelines inside of these repos that will help you understand how to help contribute. So I would take that approach, the people first approach, before I started submitting a whole bunch of code, basically. Eric's pointing out that if you're really determined to self-manage your own distro, the cluster API project, provisioning, automation, and management. Yeah, so cluster API has become really cool. It's a great idea. I'm so glad they're doing it. So in addition to what Eric's talking about, go look up cluster API inside of YouTube, and you will find the teams talking about the status of it and where it's going, and you'll see examples of using it. So, but to me, that automatically, I assume if you're cluster API, that you are a developer and an infrastructure expert, and you understand infrastructure and how to build out all sorts of things like certificate roots, trusted certificates, the secure communications, firewall ports, all those things, right? You have to know a lot before you start digging into that stuff. Whereas something like deploying OpenShift, or maybe even Rancher, because Rancher's like, copy and paste these commands, and now here's a website, and now you can click and install, clicky, 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 right? Those are much lower bar of entry than something like the cluster API. But yeah, it's a cool project. Thanks for bringing that up, Eric. It's a great point. Our users can set up containers in our K8's testbed environment, and depends on their containers, their user will use those services. So now how we can get their client's IP? I don't know. I'm not really sure I understand the full question. Hashim, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I'm not sure how else, maybe be a little, like when you say client IP, are you talking about their IP on their local machine? Are you talking about the IP of the container they're using? Yeah, I'm not really sure what you're referring to. So maybe get a little more descriptive on the problem that you're trying to solve. Can you please explain what Rancher is and how it helps a beginner? Rancher is a distribution of Kubernetes. So there are 100 plus distributions of Kubernetes. So just like Linux has many different distributions, Kubernetes has many distributions that are all a collection of the same open source upstream repo. So the vanilla Kubernetes. So they're all supporting the same API. So it doesn't really matter which one you use. They will all support your manifest files. They will support the same API. But the different distributions, Docker Enterprise is a Kubernetes distribution. Rancher is a distribution. OpenShift is a distribution. SUSE, they have a distribution. So those distributions are a combination of the same open source upstream, and then all their own tooling, maybe their own custom dashboard, maybe their own custom deployment tool for installing new nodes and installing Kubernetes on those nodes. Maybe they include support for specific ingress providers for proxying. Maybe they include specific storage tools because, for example, NetApp, the storage company, has their own Kubernetes. So they'll probably include all their own storage tooling as a part of it. And so your job is to look at the field of these different tools and compare which ones you think you need, usually based on existing relationships and what you're familiar with. If you're already a VMware shop or Red Hat shop, you should definitely be looking at their tooling as one of the potential offers. But Rancher is one of the ones, it's not the only one, but it's a popular one that's been around a long time. And Rancher is one of the ones that is agnostic, meaning that they're not OS specific. They'll run on any Linux distribution, and they support a lot of the tooling in the industry. So I tend to point people their direction when they don't really have a preference, but they know they can't use the cloud, right? So if you're on Amazon, then use Amazon's tools if you can. If you're on Azure, use Azure's tools if you can. But if you can't, and you're in your own data center, then you could look at something like Rancher as one of the options for deploying it. That's way easier and to use that tool than it is to try to, use kubeadmin as a tool, which it's an open source tool as a part of the Kubernetes ecosystem. And it's a great tool, but I don't recommend it to enterprises because typically they need a lot more tooling. They need easier management. They need predictable upgrade paths. And they need a paid support team that they can call when the crap hits the fan, right? They can call somebody and get support. So that's what Rancher and many other companies do. How to import a database into MySQL container. So we've talked about that a lot on this show before, Deep Learn. It's actually built with the standard. If you just go to Docker Hub, go to the MySQL page and read it. If you just go there, it will tell you exactly where to put the SQL files so that they auto import. And you basically are just going to either copy them into a custom image, or you're going to bind mount them at runtime, and you can put them in a very specific location, and it tells you all in Docker Hub how to do that. All right, Hashim, I'm going to read your post here. Right now, the only thing we could think of, this is about getting client IPs in Kubernetes. So right now, the only thing we could think of was to set external traffic of services to local so that we are preserving the user IPs instead of getting replaced by services. Then set up a pod beside user on a container, which we can monitor the network and find the user IPs. The pod's a container. I've created a question in Stack Overflow and explain it with a figure. Maybe if you see that figure, it'll become more clear about what to do. So I think, I'm assuming that, is this a web? Oh, I don't know if this is a web protocol, if you're talking about HTTP, but typically if you're doing HTTP, what you're going to have to probably resort to is dealing with the proxy protocols for headers inside of your HTTP packets, so that you're preserving the original IP address coming all through the proxies. Because the reality is Kubernetes is full of proxies. There's proxies all over the place. You have a proxy, your ELBs and your ALBs in Amazon are a proxy, and then you're going to have your ingress proxies. And if you're doing server mesh, there's proxies on every container on every server. So trying to maintain the same source IP without any level of proxying or natting is really hard to do in Kubernetes, and requires it limits your design. So assuming that you're doing HTTP, you're going to look into the proxy protocol, which will allow you to add the header for the original client IP that can be preserved through each step of the way through all the proxies, as long as they know about that host header. So that's what you would probably have to do. If it's not HTTP, then, or you're not using supported proxies that support it, then I don't really have a good answer for you, because it will require a lot of work, and it'd be very dependent upon your setup. And using services that aren't using they aren't using like a node IP, or they're not using a cluster IP, right? They would have endpoints only. So you would have to be able to route directly to the pod IP, and the pod IP subnet would have to be routable from where your external connections are. And that's very specific to it depends on how you set up the cluster. It depends on where the cluster is hosted. It depends on how your servers are connected to the internet. Are they connected directly, or is there something that's already masking their IP? Like, there's so many dependencies there that it's going to be challenging to answer that without basically a project where we dive into all the ways that you're setting this up in the environment you're set up with the applications you're using. But if it's HTTP, the easiest thing is to just look up, let's see, Kubernetes. Yeah, looking up the proxy protocol. So see here on my screen, proxy protocol client IP. So the forwarded headers and stuff like that. So that's kind of the research that you need to look into if it's HTTP based, and that's how you can help solve that problem. And that means that you're able to use all the proxy things that you need to use, all the load balancers like you could, but preserve the IP address of the incoming clients. Hopefully that helps. All right. Yeah, Istio service mesh and stuff like that, but that's probably only if they're HTTP based. Yeah. Thanks, Amir. Okay. How can I integrate Rook storage with K8s? So we talked a little bit about Rook storage in a previous episode. So why don't you go back looking on my Bret.live channel, looking for storage. We looked at Rook storage on how to implement it, and basically just follow their implementation guide. The Rook storage website has an implementation guide, and it will whether you're going to use, because Rook is a storage management system. It is not the storage, right? So Rook itself means you have to decide once you have your Kubernetes, and then once you have Rook installed, you have to decide what type of storage do you need. Do you want Ceph storage, which replicates it across your multiple hosts? Do you want to use something like EFS and AWS, which is external shared storage, or you want to use EBS, Elastic Block Storage? You basically have to figure out which kind of storage you need, and that's based on what kind of applications you're running and what are your application requirements. So that's the big part of any storage project, and Rook isn't going to make that decision for you. You've got to figure that out. So hopefully that helps get you started. Is there a good source you recommend that helps to learn the structure of servers? For example, Java, to understand more how to build a Java container from scratch. I'm not sure. So are you, let's see, I'm not sure what this question's about, really. Is this about, like, I mean, Java in a container behaves like Java normally, except for a few small things. One of them is that you need to make sure that it's behaving the C groups, and so for Java, for example, assuming you've taken like my Docker course, my Kubernetes course, right? So you've learned all the tooling. Just go into YouTube and search for, and I think I have some of these resources in my Docker Mastery course. Go look up Java Docker on YouTube, and you will find some talks from conferences on Java best practices in containers. And so that's what I would tend to do for any language. And usually that there's not a whole lot to it. It's usually just learning how to make a Docker file. And once you've built a couple of Docker files in a couple of languages or frameworks, the rest become pretty intuitive, because it's more about learning the process of where do I put my package manager lines? Where do I put my, the package manager dependencies, like my apt-get or my yums, right? Where do you put those versus the package manager itself? Where do I put my minification commands and all the other commands that you might have for building your application? And, for example, I have a repo. It's not Spring Boot. I can't remember what it's called. I have a repo on Java. Oh, it's a pet. I think it's pet. Yeah, Pet Clinic. So it's an example of how to build a Docker file for a Java app. I'll throw that for you in there. But there's not a whole lot in it that's very Java specific. It's really just how to apply Docker concepts to yet another Docker file. And you'll see that the Docker file is under Spring Clinic app. And then you can look at it there. And it's really just picking the image I want to start from, copying in my dependencies, and then running Maven, right? And then once I got that, and then I actually use, this one's got a multi-stage image, so it's a little more advanced, but it shows you how to separate out your dev dependencies from your production dependencies, and away you go. I do not have a video on that, but there are a few people that have done that. They've done presentations out there. Yeah, I don't think that's not mine. That's someone else's presentation. And I'm not a Java expert, but I do help teams implement all sorts of, I'm not an expert on really any any development environment, but I help all different teams. And so the only advantage I have is that I've just seen a lot of Docker files. So I don't even believe you have to be an expert in that particular language or in the tooling itself. You just have to write a couple of Docker files in different languages so that you get a hang of the overall process. And then you just keep applying that process to whatever the build tool is and whatever the dependency installer tool is. And, at the end of the day, those are all very similar. You just have to figure out what the right command is to do it, Great question, though. Great topic. Can you suggest, I'm a developer from India, just finished your K's course. Hey, thank you for buying my courses. Really excited for implementation. Can you suggest any project or open source repos to start? The most interesting ones to me are you to go take an application that you are interested in, right? Go take that and then make it work in Docker, then make it work in Kubernetes. And the process of you taking whatever your favorite app is, I mean, you can look just, you can just Google demo apps, like, and then, demo application, and then your language, right? Like Java, and then you can type site:/github.com. So if you do that site:/github.com, that'll only show you results that are hosted on GitHub. And then it tends to show you them in order of their popularity. It's not 100%, but your first page will be popular demo apps. And so just go through those. And it doesn't matter whether they're Docker friendly. The learning and the struggle that I go through is taking this. For example, I had never used the Pet Clinic. I didn't know anything about it. So I took it, and not even knowing Maven that well, I knew what Maven was, but I didn't know Maven commands. And just, it took me a couple of days to dig into what Maven is, to read a bunch of blog articles, and to get together a working Docker file. And then once it worked, it would run. But then it was probably very large. So then I had to go back and like massage my commands to figure out how to make a smaller image out of that. And then I had to figure out how to make the Docker Compose file so that it would work inside of it with a database and a local development environment. And then you worry about Kubernetes, and then you go start from scratch, make a brand new Kubernetes manifest file, and just start building it over time. Honestly, you learn more that way than you do, I think, by a pre-created perfect example app that is already designed for Docker and Kubernetes. That's what I do in my consulting. That's what I do as hobby. And that's what I do before I make a course. So I learn this way and I advocate it. It's not the fastest way, right? I mean, you're not hand-fed this stuff. You have to sit down and really focus for hours, but you will learn so much stuff. Like and then it will stick in your brain even better because you had to break it and then fix it and break it. And that's why we have the Slack chat, right? You go back to the Slack chat for the courses and you ask these questions, and hopefully someone there can help you with answers. So, hey, Nuno, my fellow Docker captain, hanging out in chat. Hi, Hashim, you're welcome. And thank you to all of you that have had the great questions. So I've been going for almost 2 hours. Holy cow. All right. So I'm going to wrap it up. Again, remember my Patreon. Go check it out. If you're a member, you get to join if you're a High Five member for $5 a month, you get to join a monthly video hangout where we all just talk DevOps. And we're going to be scheduling the September one here pretty soon. We're also working on more benefits that are going to be in a hiring package. We're also working on a Discord chat in case you're into Discord chat. If you don't like Slack, or if you want to do both, you can do both. But a lot more is coming there. But this show is sponsored by you. And so those of you that are members of my Patreon, thank you so much. We get new ones every week, and you're the reason this show keeps going, and that it helps us pay the bills to make this possible. So thanks again. I appreciate all of you. And I will see you next week here on YouTube Live on Thursday. And we're going to be talking some more containers and DevOps. So come back and join us. See you later.